As we come close to Christmas, when many plan to prepare for a festival season and think of taking a break, for a lot of people, Christmas brings financial challenges and no doubt homelessness. According to recent research carried out by Shelter, a homelessness charity, there are over 271 people recorded as homeless, and just over 123 of them are children in England. This figure then raises the question: what is homelessness? Can being homeless impact your prospect of getting a new home? Where does financial help come into play to come out of homelessness? Can the welfare state fully support a homeless person? How can a homeless person's debts impact getting into your new home? To answer some of these questions on this Dead Talk podcast, with me, Ripon Ray, as your host, I have expert panelists who are experts in welfare rights and no doubt from the debt sector. I'm also expecting the panelists to provide Dead Talk listeners with top tips for those who may find themselves sleeping rough or homeless. So, in this podcast, I have Deven Ghelani, Director of Policy and Practice, who also created a Better of calculator, which navigates what financial support is available for those who are seeking to maximize income. And finally, Amy Taylor, Debt Advisor and Chair of Greater Manchester Money Advice Group. Amy also advises social and housing tenants to keep their home through her advice work. For those who are listening to that talk and want to share your experience or want to listen to a subject, send me an email, ripon.ray@yourdoctordebt.com, or on Twitter, yourdoctordebt. So before we delve into with Amy, let me ask Deven Ghelani. Deven, from your understanding of homelessness, what is actually homelessness and how extreme is homelessness in the UK?
Well, I guess it's on a spectrum. You've got people who are sleeping rough, literally don't have a roof over their heads, and then you've got a huge amount of hidden homelessness. So over 100,000 households in temporary accommodation today, and that can be families with children. It could be single people, but not really having any fixed place to live, not knowing how long they're going to be there for. And then you've got general housing insecurity. So people who are living in, perhaps rented accommodation, but are very concerned about rent rises or what's going to come next around the corner. Maybe they're in debt to others today and kind of taking money out of their, what should be going toward their day-to-day expenses, getting by food, heating, water, others in order to pay for their rent. And while they're not homeless, they're certainly missing out on support that they might need because just the cost of housing is so high, the availability of housing or decent housing is so poor across the UK right now. Unless you've got a home, of course, which I think that's one of the biggest policy divides we're seeing at the moment is people who have a home, been lucky enough to buy a home, particularly if you're able to do so much earlier, are doing well. It's very hard for them not to do well in some respects, and I appreciate that's not everyone, but in general terms. Whereas if you're renting on a low income, it can be very, very difficult. So yeah, it's a huge spectrum. It's a very complex area in and of itself, particularly when you wrap up benefit eligibility and wider debt pressures into it, it becomes a very complex picture for people to manage.
I mean, you spent years navigating the benefit system in your current role as director and also as universal credit and welfare specialist. Do you genuinely think that the current benefit system is fit for purpose and can support alleviating the trouble that many homelessness people are facing?
So I guess there are two ways of thinking about the benefit system. One is the level of support it provides to people and asking whether or not that's sufficient. And the second one is accessing that support and how the system treats you as you try to access it. And I'd say, today the current social security system is deficient on both counts, really. So my interest in this space came about in 2007 after I was let go from a company I was working for at the time and had to claim benefits myself. So that was over 15 years ago, dealing with the legacy benefit system. I remember going to the job centre, claiming job seekers allowance. I was renting in London at the time, but no one at the time told me about housing benefit. So this relationship between benefits and housing, in my case, it really wasn't clear. But actually, in lots of people's cases, it isn't really clear, right? Benefits are thought of in their own silos. Job seekers allowance is one thing to administer. Housing benefit is another thing to administer. And in some respects, universal credit should try and bring some of that together. I think it maybe has helped a bit. I don't know. A lot of people disagree. I don't think it's helped enough. I don't think work coaches they might be thinking about, the administrative side of that. They're not really thinking about the quality of housing, any housing pressures, any wider debt issues. And then the second point is the amount of housing support people are getting sufficient? And in before April 2013, the level of housing support you could get through the benefit system would cover about half of all homes in an area. That was cut to cover only a third of all homes in an area. You'd think that would save a huge amount, but actually it doesn't save as much as you might think. So that 40% fall in the availability of homes you could afford only saves about 6% of the housing budget, because rents aren't linear. They all kind of bunch up around a median. And the situation hasn't gone much better since, because other benefits have been frozen. That means other income, rents have gone up astronomically, which means that other income you might have has had to go toward your housing if you want to keep a roof over your head. And all of that's increased the pressures. And we work with over 80 local authorities across the country. And often it's the housing teams that bring in support, the type of support we offer around income maximization or identifying households that are struggling financially early, because ultimately the failure to act, the failure to be proactive and help those residents today means they're much more likely to end up homeless in the future.
So when you do find yourself in a vulnerable situation such as homelessness, so where does Department of Work and Pensions and other stakeholders play a part?
I mean, I guess if I look at it positively, you can sometimes have kind of specific housing or homelessness teams based in job centres. That's far too infrequent, I would say, particularly given the scale. The problem is growing in scale. Generally, I don't think that coordination. There are efforts to kind of have that coordination in place, and often we talk about those, or you see examples of those positive cases. I think they're interesting cases just because it should probably be more standard practice. I think you're helping people access the financial support they need to pay for their housing or whatever's available through the benefit system, but there's not really extra support there through the job centre itself if that housing support is insufficient or if the housing quality is poor. That then goes to, you might then need to go to the local authority to apply for discretionary housing payments or other discretionary support. So it's an example of how the benefit system itself is fragmented. And if you want to take action against your landlord, that's a whole another stream of challenge you have to go through to be able to do that, because it really isn't straightforward. And the system probably favours landlords over tenants. The current system favours landlords over tenants.
I spoke to a civil servant at the National Energy Conference last week, and he incidentally stated that you were behind the creation of universal credit, not necessarily Ian Duncan Smith. Is that right?
Well, I worked on it at the Centre for Social Justice. So I guess, after being on benefits myself, I started to do my own research in why the system is so fragmented. After speaking to a lot of people in and around Westminster, they all pointed me toward the Centre for Social Justice, and I joined their team as they're working on a report called Dynamic Benefits, which, if you remember, when universal credit was first introduced, it was this, people recognized the problems that the current benefit system or the legacy benefit system today put in front of people. The fact that it was fragmented, you had to apply many times, you had these different departments administering a whole range of benefits, each of which had their own rules. And this universal credit was an effort to kind of bring all of that together. So you only had to apply in one place to access all of that support, and you'd always be better off in work. Those are the principles. Yeah. So I worked on that when it was a policy idea, and the reason I run policy in practice is partly to see what happens to policy as it turns into practice, and it can be challenging.
You have been campaigning around billions of pounds that are not claimed. Tell us more about it, and what do you mean by billions unclaimed?
Yeah, so a report we wrote in April of this year which actually featured on the front page of The Guardian. It's always nice when you get a big splash around these things when you've been working very hard. Policy report identified the total amount of unclaimed benefits and other rights-based support, such as social tariffs, like nationally administered benefits, locally administered benefits, and those administered by regulated entities, at £19 billion. That's quite a big uplift on what previous estimates were, and I think that's because the system itself has become quite a bit more fragmented. There's other types of support schemes that have popped up in response to the cost of living, and that's why we felt the report was necessary. Because it's very hard if you're on the front line to keep tabs of all of the different types of support the people who are trying to support might be able to access, where to go to access that, and we bring all of that together in the Better Off calculator, which people can access through gov.uk, or advisors can license by contacting us. But yeah, that £19 billion is to me, it's a huge number, isn't it? And that's every year. And it's worth mentioning that it excludes, from that number, we exclude discretionary support, so things like discretionary housing payments and the household support fund. And it also excludes disability benefits because they're not rights-based. You have to go through a disability assessment. So we couldn't say for certain whether or not, just because you felt you were disabled, whether or not you'd be able to access that support or not. But we reckon if you add those two together, you're getting above £23 billion, £24 billion worth of unclaimed support each year.
You've briefly talked about Better Off calculator. What's the underlying purpose behind it?
Well, initially I built it, as a hobby. Back in 2012, I had to explain universal credit to people, and I could see their eyes glaze over as I was talking to them. They didn't want to understand the policy concept behind it. They wanted to know what it meant for them or their employees or their, the people they were trying to support. So over a long weekend in I think around April 2012, I built it in as an online website, and by the end of the month I had 20,000 people. It's called the Universal Credit Calculator originally. By the end of the month I had 20,000 people using it. I was dealing with blog inquiries till 2 a.m. And lots of people wanted me to develop it further. And I think the benefit calculators that were available at the time online, you basically had to be an expert in social security to be able to use them. They weren't very Google-esque, they weren't kind of brought up to date to today's web standards. So luckily I got a small grant from Unlimited, hired a developer to build it properly, and haven't really looked back. So I left my role at the Centre for Social Justice, and I saw there's a bigger gap in helping people to navigate the social security system and communicate what changes in policy would mean for them through this software than there was in trying to shepherd little bits of legislation through, partly because a lot of that had already gone through around universal credit by that point. So we still campaign on a policy level, but I think what gets us out of bed is helping people access the support that they need, and it makes a real tangible difference to their lives. We reckon we help people access over £1 billion worth of support each year when you look at the numbers that use it today.
I mean, the current Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is considering a big benefit squeeze. What does that mean for people like, I suppose, many people who might be facing homelessness and who are vulnerable in our communities?
I mean, well, we've had the autumn statement now. I think it was a brief respite in the end. I think there was a lot of concern around what it might put forward, but I think we avoided the worst of it. There's an increase in the local housing allowance. There's an increase in the national living wage. Benefits have been uprated in line with inflation. I don't think it goes far enough, partly because of the last decade of cuts, freezes and squeezes on people's incomes. So benefits are worth around 7.5–8% less in real terms than they were 10 years ago. So we have to make up for that shortfall, and this budget didn't do that. It probably didn't squeeze them too much further, which I guess is the respite that I was talking about. And I think we need to go further, because while it matched general inflation, people on lower incomes face higher. We've seen food inflation at higher levels than other types of inflation this year, and you can't get away from having to buy food. So I think it was, the autumn statement was better than expected, but really we need a society that's willing to invest in social security. We need to make the arguments for it. And I thought the pandemic created an opportunity for that, but I'm not sure that it's been taken yet.
I mean, moving forward, really, what changes do you want to see to help homeless and rough sleepers to ease the pressure for them?
Easier to access support, more specialisms around that. That's easier to access either within job centre or local authority settings. Fundamentally, I think what we need is more homes, because, as I mentioned, it's not just rough sleepers. It's a lot of people in temporary accommodation who are really struggling to find accommodation that they can afford. Maybe fundamentally, if we're getting bigger picture about this, a rebalancing toward tenants, the rights of tenants. And I've been running this organization, Policy and Practice, for 10 years, and it's been reasonably successful. I like to think we're making quite a big impact, and we support more and more local authorities. But I'd say in that time, growing a successful organization, the biggest difference in my time since I started it has been buying a home, right? So you can't underestimate the level of well-being you have when you know you live somewhere. I think if I were coming up with a campaign slogan, Ripon, I'd talk about homes over houses, right? You're prioritizing a home over a house or a property. If that makes sense to you. I'm not sure if that was clear enough, but it's not a very good slogan if it isn't. But prioritizing people's homes over houses that are available for rent.
Well, you have to start from somewhere. If it works, I think you're nearly there. So you have to start with the slogan. Now, the next question is how that slogan manifests itself into practicality. So, Deven, thank you for that. Let me get Amy Taylor, desk advisor, into the conversation to explore how being homeless impacts rebuilding someone's life. So, Amy, based on what you've heard from Deven, what are your initial thoughts?
My initial thoughts are that local authorities are on their knees at the moment. The structure is crumbling, and that's a lot to do with the budgets that are set by national government for local government. That is not enough. So being squeezed every year in, year out. And with the crisis facing people in homelessness at the moment, councils are having to spend so much money on temporary accommodation, B&Bs, hostels, trying to rehouse people, even just, temporarily. And there's no budget for that. So this is reducing councils the ability they have to manage their services, to deal with the levels of homelessness around them. It's just crippling them. So it's sort of all well and good to think that the autumn statement wasn't that bad, but I thought it was terrible. I thought, okay, they're unfreezing LHA, local housing allowance, for the first time in 3 years. But we are talking about rent being paid at the lowest 30th percentile. So we're not talking about market rents now, because the rents are, have gone into the stratosphere in the last few years. It's just unaffordable for people to get on that very first rung of the ladder, whether it be renting or buying. So I didn't like anything that Jeremy Hunt had to say about people on sickness benefits and disability benefits. It feels like the most vulnerable people are being attacked. And for me, if you're homeless, you are the most vulnerable you are ever going to be. You may have debts, you may have addiction, you may have health problems, physical and mental, and recovering from that is really difficult when we essentially do not have a safety net anymore. So, not to rattle on too much, but absolutely terrible government policies in relation to things like the treatment of people seeking asylum, basically evicting them from hotels, making them instantly homeless. That's not helping. The fact that universal credit, unfortunately, although the idea is a good one, in as much as you're putting all of these benefits together and making it simpler, unfortunately, it's now much easier to punish people. So sanctions, sanction big chunks of somebody's benefit if they don't turn up for an appointment at the job centre or whatever. It's leaving people without enough money to pay the shortfalls in their rent, shortfalls in their mortgage. It's increasing the likelihood that they're going to fail. So that's the initial thoughts.
I mean, you worked in the debt advice sector for many, many years, Amy, and you've also served a variety of communities. From what you've seen and heard, what are the main causes of people getting or being homeless? Is it just not enough money, or is there anything else going on?
Well, as I say, there's a number of different things going on at the same time. So number one, there's not enough housing, and with the change that came in that reduces people's housing allowance for having a spare bedroom, for instance, there's now a shortfall. So people need to downsize, but they haven't got the homes to go to. Those smaller properties, single bedroom, 2 bedrooms, they're not available. So there is just a jam in the system. People can't downsize, but they can't afford where they live. And eventually, and this, whether this be social housing or private housing, eventually action gets taken. They have rent arrears, they are then evicted. And where do they go then? And as I said to you, there's hotels being emptied of people who are being processed, who've sought asylum, and once they're processed, they're being thrown out onto the street, literally. So, what do you do in that situation? Not only are you in a new country that you're not familiar with the systems and maybe can't even speak the language, but you're now homeless. We've got women who are fleeing abuse at home, and you'd think that if you go into a shelter, maybe that's free, but it isn't. You have to then pay for that as well. So the temporary accommodation is some of the most expensive accommodation, actually, and it's not good accommodation. It's nothing you would aspire to. So for me, I'm seeing a system that's really broken. And even though we've got some ability to make discretionary payments, it's just not enough. There's not enough money there to get people back on their feet.
Speaking of people and people getting back on their feet, if you are carrying debts with you, how those debts will impact you moving forward and getting your new home. And if you do, can you sustain your new home? What actually happens to debts?
So usually in debt advice, we talk about priorities, paying your priority debts. And the number one is always housing, be it your mortgage or be it your rent. You try to pay your rent and then work your way down: gas and electric, council tax, food, and the things that you need to buy each and every week or month. So if you are made homeless and you have non-priority debt, because at the stage that you've lost your home, all of your debt is non-priority because the worst has happened to you, nothing can be done. You're not going to go to prison. They can't take your house off you because they already have. Can't switch off your gas and electric because you don't have any anymore. So if you're street homeless or in temporary accommodation, all of your debt will sit there and potentially wait until you are back in a position where perhaps you're earning again, or you've managed to find social housing or something like that. And then I guess it will restart. However, if you've changed address, it may take them some time to catch up with you.
Now, we know many private landlords or their agents will do a credit check. Now, how would having a bad credit due to non-payment of your debts would impact you actually, going back home or getting a home in the first place?
It's going to be a huge problem for you. If you have a bad credit file, a poor credit score, lots of debts, maybe county court judgments on there, then you are really going to struggle to rent from a private landlord, and a mortgage is almost certainly not going to happen. Debts will sit on a credit file for 6 years from the point where you receive the default or the county court judgment. So it's going to be very, very difficult to pass credit checks to get yourself in private rent, or even if you're thinking about buying a house, if you're in that position. If you are looking for social housing, not so much a problem, unless, of course, you have rent arrears from a former social housing tenancy, whereupon these can be used to, I guess, blacklist you. So some housing associations will say that unless your former tenancy arrears are below £500, then they're not actually willing to rehouse you. It's difficult to get around that. Normally, social landlords want to see that you are able to pay off the arrears, even if it's about making an arrangement to start paying those arrears off. Or if you can look at debt solutions, if you see a debt advisor, they may be able to talk you through something like a debt relief order to get those debts written off so that you can start again. But it's certainly not easy once you're in that position, presuming that you haven't got a lot of money, to be able to get back into housing.
Thank you, Amy. Debt Talk did invite a Minister for Housing and Communities to get a fair balance of discussion on this podcast. I'm still waiting for the response, really, so let's see where things go. But for those who are listening to Debt Talk at podcast and want to share your experience or want to hear a subject of your choice, you can get in touch with me, ripon.ray@yourdrdebt.com, or on Twitter, yourdrdebt. Let me go back to Deven and Amy, who are to provide Debt Talk listeners with top tips for those who are thinking of approaching, I suppose, local authorities or trying to come out of homelessness. Let me start with Deven Ghelani.
Yeah, I think it's worth, Ripon, just thinking a bit about who listens to this podcast, right? So if it's people who are in debt, which are, I'd probably give some slightly different advice. I'm assuming it's more kind of debt manager, debt professionals. And in that situation, I'll kind of highlight a couple of things that we're doing that hopefully is making a difference. And it's all about getting to people as early as possible before that debt position spirals into something that becomes harder to engage them on, harder to get out of, more stressful for everyone concerned, particularly the person in debt who you're trying to help, but with knock-on consequences for the creditors too. So I'll highlight two things that we're doing at the moment. So one is working an awful lot to identify people who are struggling with debt early. So we work with local authorities across the UK, identifying people who are struggling with council tax arrears, who may be in the private rented sector, maybe in social housing. We can loop in, if it's council homes, we can loop in those arrears as well to kind of combine debts. But generally treating this being in debt as an early indicator of financial difficulty elsewhere, a symptom of wider debt. And at the same time, knowing who's in debt doesn't necessarily let you help them, but proactively identifying for those people if they're missing out on benefits or other support. So if they're struggling financially, if you can lower their water bill, lower their energy bill, help them access council tax support, help them access pension credit or universal credit, or many other types of benefits and support, you can make a real difference. Our goal is to get people out of that cash shortfall, negative budget situation, and help them build financial resilience, really. So that's one thing, is use your data to identify people who are struggling, and help them access support they may be missing out on. I think the second top tip I'd give is, people sometimes come to they don't always come to one partner for debt. You don't know where they're going to turn when they first struggle and ask for help. So we're trying to embed that help in as many places as possible. So more recently, we've been working with water companies because often that's one of the first debts that can go unpaid because they're not able to cut off your water bill. We're working with energy companies too, because energy companies you start to struggle with, and we've been able to integrate as part of the social tariff assessment. They're not just being assessed for the social tariff with their water company, they're being assessed for the whole range of benefits at the same time. So the support they're getting from their water company, they're getting the wider set of support as well, and hopefully accessing more income than they otherwise would. That means that they're far less likely to get into water debt in the future. But it also means they're less likely to get into other types of debt, or more likely to get out of other types of debt if they're already in it. You know, if you're helping them access energy support or council tax support. So those are two things we're doing, you know, using data to proactively identify people early, and embed that support into as many places as possible.
Finally, from Amy Taylor.
I think the first thing is just get help. Go to your council, go to your local law centre, go to your local citizens advice, ask for any and all help available. See if there's anything under the household support fund that you can apply for. So I know locally we are receiving many applications to our household support fund from people who are homeless for all kinds of things, clothing so that you can stay as warm as you possibly can over the winter, food, obviously. Just ask for help because help is there. Help and advice is there. Don't feel ashamed about asking for it because we want to help you. And my second tip, and it's a little bit political, is do us all a favour. Don't vote Tory at the next election. Maybe we'll get a chance of reconstructing whatever strands are left of the safety net and start looking after people again.
Thank you, Amy. Just to recap, I did invite Minister for Housing and Communities to take part in order to make sure that the discussion is well balanced. But of course, I still would like to thank my panel members for giving their precious time to speak on debt, housing, and homelessness. My next podcast is going to be on gambling and debt. Thank you for listening to Debt Talk podcast with me as your host, Ripon Ray.